The scent of warm bread filled the air, wrapping around me like a blanket I couldn't escape. Every morning began the same way, in that tiny corner bakery in the heart of old Athens, where the walls were stained with stories and sorrow, and the ovens never really cooled down. My name is Sophia De Laurentiis, and at 23, this bakery wasn't just my job, it was my entire life. I was raised behind those wooden counters, between bags of flour and trays of kaluri. My mother passed when I was 13. Since then, it's been just me and Papa, and lately, mostly just me. His health had faded like the paint on our shop windows, quietly, then all at once. Some days he could barely make it out of bed, but still, he'd smile. Still, he'd say, "Everything will be fine, my little dove." But it wasn't fine. The bills were stacked behind the cash drawer. The whispers from the hospital had turned to threats. I sold everything that could be sold. Mama's jewelry, Papa's books, even my violin once. But I couldn't sell my heart, could I? And yet, I was about to. That morning, the rain was gentle, like the sky was too tired to cry properly. I stood, behind the counter, kneading dough with fingers that trembled more from fear than effort. My apron was dusted with flour, my cheeks pink from the heat of the oven. Outside, the world moved on. Tourists passing, lovers laughing, umbrellas spinning in the wind. And I was still here, stuck, drowning. Then the bell above the door jingled. I looked up, expecting another traveler in search of something sweet. But what I saw instead was a man, soaked to the bone, dark curls dripping, coat clinging to him like it too, was searching for warmth. His eyes were dark, unreadable. Not cold, just distant. Like he'd seen storms far worse than this one. "Sorry," he said softly, wiping his hands on the doorframe. "I didn't mean to come in like this." His voice was like Greek coffee, low, rich, and slightly bitter around the edges. "It's all right," I replied, grabbing a towel and walking toward him. "You look like you fought the rain and lost." He gave a small smile, the kind that barely reached the corners of his mouth. I handed him the towel, and for a second, our hands touched. His were cold, but steady. Calm. Like the ocean before. "A shipwreck. Thank you," he said, meeting my eyes. "I'm Alex. Just Alex. No last name, no story. Just a name hanging in the air like the steam rising from our oven." I didn't know then that Alex would rewrite every chapter of my life. After he left that morning, the bakery felt quieter than usual. The scent of cinnamon still lingered, and the oven still crackled, but the air felt different, emptier. I kept busy, wiping down the counter and reshaping the loaves with more force than necessary, pretending that I wasn't still thinking about him. Alex. Just Alex. The way he stood, in the doorway, soaked and silent, like he was carrying something heavier than the rain on his shoulders. By noon, Papa came downstairs. He looked tired, older than he had just a few weeks ago. His skin was pale, his breath shallow, but his smile never changed. I served him tea, trying to hide my worry. "We'll be okay," I said softly, placing the cup in front of him. He didn't respond right away, just stared at the rising steam. Then he finally said, "Sophia, there's something I need to tell you." My heart sank. I hated those words. They never came before anything good. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a letter. It was wrinkled and slightly torn at the corner, like it had been opened and closed too many times. My name was written on the front, but not in his handwriting. "What is this?" I asked. "It's help," he said, his voice cracking. "But it comes with a condition." I slowly sat down across from him, my hands tightening around the edge of the table. "What kind of condition?" Papa looked away, unable to meet my eyes. "Marriage." The words slammed into me like cold water. "To who?" He swallowed. "To someone from a wealthy family. Greek. Powerful. They've agreed to cover my medical expenses, erase the bakery's debts. Everything." But they want— He hesitated. You. The silence between us was brutal. It stretched like a tightrope I didn't want to walk. You want me to marry a stranger? I whispered. His face was full of guilt. I wouldn't ask you if it wasn't the only way. I don't have time, Sophia. I don't have strength. And I can't watch this place fall apart. Not while you're still young and full of life. My chest felt heavy. But I don't even know his name. He didn't answer. That evening, I stood by the bakery window, watching the raindrops slide down the glass like falling stars. The world outside was still spinning, people living their lives while mine felt like it was being sold off piece by piece. Then, like a scene pulled from a dream, I saw him again. Alex. He stood across the street, hands in his coat pockets, watching the shop like it was something sacred. I opened the door before I could talk myself out of it. Twice in one day? I said, trying to sound light. His smile was subtle. You never forget good bread. We both laughed. It was small, but real. And for a moment, I forgot about contracts, debt, and desperate choices. We talked again about nothing, about everything. He asked me about the bakery, about the best view of the Acropolis, about the violin I had displayed on the shelf behind the counter. He never asked personal questions, but he listened closely to every answer I gave. And I didn't ask about him. Not yet. Sometimes it's easier to believe in a beautiful moment than ruin it by asking too many questions. That night, I played my violin by the open window. The notes drifted over the rooftops of Athens like petals on water, and in every note, I poured the ache of uncertainty and the strange warmth of a stranger's gaze. The days that followed blurred into one another. Warm bread in the morning, flour-covered counters, Papa's quiet coughs echoing through the walls. Life moved forward, even when I felt like I was standing still. And then, Alex started coming by more often. Sometimes he'd buy a loaf, other times just a coffee. Sometimes he wouldn't buy anything at all, just stand by the counter, leaning against the wood, asking about my day. Not in a forced way, not to fill silence. Just listening. Really listening. I didn't know why I kept waiting for him to show up. Maybe it was the way he smiled when he saw me. Maybe it was how he never asked about my past, never tried to impress me with stories or charm. He was just present, like a steady rhythm behind a melody. One afternoon, after the lunch rush, we sat on the steps outside the bakery. The sun hung low behind the ancient rooftops, casting everything in gold. Alex tore a piece of kaluri and offered half to me. So, he said, chewing thoughtfully, what does Sophia dream of? I hesitated. No one asked me that anymore. Most people just assumed I gave up on dreaming long ago. I used to want to be a musician, I said quietly. A violinist, on a real stage, lights, applause, everything. He turned to me, surprised. Used to? I shrugged. Dreams are expensive. Papa got sick. The bakery needed hands. Life doesn't wait for music. He didn't respond right away. Just looked ahead at the fading light, his jaw tense like he was holding something back. Do you still play? He asked. Sometimes, I said. When no one's listening. He turned to me then, something soft in his expression. I'd like to hear you play someday. I smiled, but it didn't reach my eyes. Maybe. That night I did play, in secret. The notes danced gently through our upstairs window, mixing with the sound of distant laughter from a nearby taverna. My violin told the story I couldn't speak, of longing, of loneliness, of standing on the edge of something I didn't understand. A week passed, then another. Each day, Alex came back, and each time he left, a part of me hoped he'd return not just for the bread, but for me. Then came the letter. I found it on the kitchen table, sealed in an envelope that felt heavier than it should. It was from the family, the one offering to save us. Their conditions were now clear. The man I was to marry? He'd agreed. The paperwork was ready. There was even a date, 2 weeks. I read it again, and again. Papa walked into the room and paused when he saw me holding the letter. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. I looked at him, voice quiet but sharp. So this is it? He looked tired. Not just sick, tired. Sophia, I only ever wanted to protect you. By selling me? His eyes dropped. By saving you, in the only way I know how. I couldn't sleep that night. I sat by the window, the violin silent beside me, and then I thought of Alex, of his voice, his presence, his steadiness, and I realized I had never asked who he really was because some part of me didn't want to know. The morning of the wedding came faster than I expected. I hadn't picked the dress. I hadn't chosen the flowers. I didn't know the man I was going to marry. But still, I stood there, wrapped in white lace that once belonged to my mother, staring into a mirror that didn't feel like it reflected me. My hair was pinned up. My lips were painted a soft rose. On the outside, I looked like a bride, but inside, I felt like a sacrifice. The ceremony was to be held at a seaside chapel just outside the city. Quiet, beautiful, detached from everything real. I rode there in silence, Papa beside me, holding my hand like he used to when I was a little girl, afraid of the dark. Only this darkness wasn't under my bed. It was walking me down the aisle. The chapel was surrounded by olive trees, their branches swaying softly in the breeze. The Aegean Sea glittered behind them like it had no idea what was happening on land. Guests were already seated. I didn't recognize most of them, men in suits, women in gowns, the wealthy, the polished, the untouchable. I looked for a familiar face. I didn't see one. The music began, slow, haunting, like it knew this wasn't a love story. I took one step forward, then another. Each footfall felt like I was walking away from everything I'd ever known. And then, I saw him, the groom. He stood at the altar, facing the sea, tall, broad shoulders, dressed in a perfectly tailored suit. My steps slowed. Something about him. He turned, and my heart stopped. It was Alex. Not a stranger, not a mystery man. Alex. His eyes met mine, those same dark, steady eyes that used to look at me from across the bakery counter. The world went quiet. No sea, no music, no breath, only his voice, low and certain, as I reached the altar. He leaned in, and in a whisper meant only for me, he said, "This contract is only on paper. Your freedom will always be yours." I didn't know what to feel. Shock? Relief? Rage? The ceremony began. I heard the priest speak, but the words blurred together. My eyes stayed on Alexios, because I now knew his full name. Alexios Dracos. I didn't speak. Not until I had to. And when they asked me if I agreed to take this man in marriage, I paused for a long moment and said softly, "Yes," because something inside me told me this wasn't the end. It was the beginning of a storm. The wedding ended quietly. No wild applause, no passionate kiss, just the echo of church bells fading into the sea breeze, and a silence between us that said more than any vow ever could. The moment the last guest left, I turned to him, my husband on paper, my stranger in truth. "You knew," I said, my voice barely holding steady. "You knew it was me. You knew this was happening." Alexios didn't deny it. He simply nodded once and said, "Yes." We were alone now, in the garden behind the chapel. The jasmine flowers trembled in the wind, and I could feel the ocean behind me, calling me to run. "I trusted you," I whispered. "You let me believe you were just normal. Just a man." "I never lied about how I felt," he replied, stepping closer, but not too close. "Everything I showed you, Every moment in that bakery, every word we shared, that was me. But I didn't plan this. I didn't know until my family told me, until your father came to mine, asking for help. I stared at him. So that's what I am to you? A request? A bargain? A favor? His jaw tightened. No. You're the only thing that's felt real in a long time. He looked down at his hands like they were foreign to him. My name is Alexios Drakos. My family owns one of the largest shipping companies in Greece. My face? It's on magazines, on gossip sites. That's why I didn't tell you who I was. I didn't want to be that person with you. I wanted to be Alex. The same hands that once carried sacks of flour in my bakery now belong to a billionaire. It didn't make sense, and yet, it did. The subtle confidence, the quiet sadness, the way he seemed out of place in the simplest clothes. I didn't want to trap you, he continued, voice softer now. When I realized you were the woman my family had agreed to help, I panicked. I didn't want you to think everything between us was fake. But you didn't stop it, I said. You let the wedding happen. You let me walk down that aisle without knowing the truth. He stepped forward, his voice raw. Because I was afraid I'd lose you if I told you. A silence fell between us, heavier than before. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small velvet box. Inside was a ring, simple, elegant, with a sapphire that shimmered like the Aegean Sea. This isn't the contract ring, he said. This is for you. If you choose me, not for your father, not for the debt, not for what I can give you, but for who I've been with you. I stared at the ring, at him, at the man who stood in my doorway soaked and kind, at the man who stood now in a tailored suit, heart in his hands. I don't know what to do, I admitted, my voice barely a whisper. You don't have to decide. Now, he said. Take time, take space. Just know, I meant it when I said your freedom is yours. He closed the box and gently placed it on the stone railing beside me. Then he walked away, leaving me with a ring, a vow, and 1,000 questions I wasn't ready to answer. The days after the wedding passed like fog. I didn't return to the Drakos estate. I didn't call Alexios. I didn't answer my father's questions. I just moved through the bakery like a shadow in my own life, mixing dough, sweeping the floor, smiling at customers I couldn't hear. Everything had changed, and yet nothing had. At night, I would hold the unopened velvet box in my hands, the one Alexios had left behind. I didn't wear the ring, but I didn't return it either. Some days, I wondered if it was all a dream, a cruel, lavish dream painted in soft candlelight and scented jasmine. But then I'd see his name on the news. Draco's heir tied to mystery bride in secret seaside wedding. My photo, blurred, taken from the side, appeared in a gossip column. They didn't know my name. Yet. But it was only a matter of time. I stayed. Indoors after that. Closed the bakery for 3 days straight. Papa didn't question it. He knew better than to poke at a wound still bleeding, and yet the silence between us grew heavier. You knew, I finally said to him one morning, my voice sharper than I meant. You knew who he was before I did. He didn't deny it. I did, he replied softly. I just didn't know how to tell you. Why didn't you stop it? He sighed and looked away. Because when you spoke about him, before you knew who he really was, I saw something in you I hadn't seen in years. Light, hope. And I told myself, maybe it didn't matter how it started. I didn't answer. I didn't know how to, because part of me understood, and part of me still felt betrayed. A week later, I walked into the bakery to find something I wasn't prepared for. Alexios. He was standing behind the counter, wearing his usual simple clothes. The flour sack he'd once lifted without effort was back on his shoulder. I needed to feel something real, he said before I could speak. I thought maybe you'd let me help again. I stared at him, unsure whether to scream or cry. Instead, I said nothing and stepped aside. We worked together in silence, side by side, kneading dough, dusting trays, serving coffee, like we used to. But the quiet wasn't peaceful this time. It was filled with everything unspoken. When the shop emptied out, he turned to me. "I never wanted to be the reason you stopped dreaming," he said. "That violin, it still sits in your upstairs window, doesn't it?" I nodded slowly. "Will you play it?" he asked. "Just once more?" I wanted to say no, but my fingers itched. So that night, I stood by the window and played, and he listened. His head bowed, like the notes were confessions he didn't deserve. When the final note faded, I spoke. "I don't know if I can forgive what you did." "I'll wait," he said quietly, "for as long as it takes." He didn't ask for anything more. He just turned and left. The next morning, the bakery felt different. Lighter, maybe, or quieter in a way that didn't ache. Alexios hadn't come back, not yet, but the echo of his presence was still in the air. I could feel it in the towel he'd folded, in the clean way he'd restacked the bread baskets. In the silence he'd left behind. I worked slower that day. Not from exhaustion, but reflection. Every step I took behind the counter brought me back to the question I hadn't answered. Could I ever trust him again? Later that afternoon, I took the long way home, through the back alleys of Plaka, where ivy climbed over old stone walls and cats lounged in doorways like royalty. It was a part of the city tourists didn't visit, a place that still belonged to those of us who didn't have gold in our pockets, but had roots. I ended up at a courtyard I hadn't been to in years, the same one where I used to sit with my mother as a child, listening to her hum songs from the radio as she braided my hair. There was no music now, just the wind and the whisper of something I didn't want to name. I closed my eyes and remembered Alexios's voice the night of the wedding. "Your freedom will always be yours." He said that with such certainty. And yet my life didn't feel free. It felt paused. What scared me wasn't his secret. It was how much I wanted to believe him. That evening, I came home to find Papa sitting by the window with an envelope in his lap. His hands trembled. "I want to show you something," he said, and handed it to me. Inside was a letter, this time not about contracts or deals. It was a letter from Alexios, written in long, careful handwriting. "Sophia, you don't owe me anything, not your trust, not your forgiveness. But I owe you the truth. I fell in love with you before I ever knew your name was tied to mine. Not because of the bakery, not because you were kind to a stranger, though you were. I fell in love because in your world, I saw the version of me I'd forgotten could exist. I won't ask you to forget, but I'll wait. Until you're ready to choose me, if ever." I read it once, twice. Then I folded it carefully and placed it in the box with the ring. No answers came that night, only sleep and dreams I couldn't remember. The next day, I reopened the bakery. I tied my apron like always, turned on the oven, opened the shutters, and just before I flipped the sign to open, I paused. Alexios was standing across the street again, hands in his pockets, waiting. But this time, he didn't come inside. He just looked at me, not asking, not pushing, just waiting. And I realized something. He was no longer trying to take something from me. He was hoping I'd offer it freely. I didn't flip the sign, not right away. For a long time, I just stood there, staring through the glass at the man who refused to give up on me. He didn't wave, didn't smile, didn't make a scene. He just waited, like someone who finally understood that love, real love, asks, not demands. I opened the door. He didn't move, neither did I. "I read your letter," I said softly. The wind tugged at my hair. The street behind us bustled like it always did, but in that moment, it felt like the world had narrowed down to this small space between us. Alexios took a slow breath. "And?" "I don't have all the answers," I whispered. "But I'm tired of pretending I don't feel anything." He stepped closer, carefully like I was glass. Sophia, I don't want a contract. I don't want your name on a paper. I want you, only if you want me to. I looked at him, at the man who had once stood in the rain with nothing to offer but soaked shoes and a gentle smile, at the man who now stood in front of me with the whole world at his feet, but his hands empty, waiting for mine. I reached for him, not because he saved my father, not because he cleared the bakery's debts, but because when everything else had become too heavy to hold, he didn't walk away. He stayed, and in a quiet voice that trembled but didn't break, I said, yes. The days that followed felt like turning pages in a new book, familiar and unfamiliar all at once. Alexios didn't sweep me off to a mansion or a private yacht. He came to the bakery, rolled up his sleeves, and helped knead dough with laughter in his eyes and flour on his face. We reopened the shop together. Papa sat near the window again, stronger now. Every time Alexios helped a customer or fixed the wire or squeaky back door, Papa smiled a little more. The guilt between us began to fade, replaced by something warmer, something healing. One evening, just after closing, Alexios brought out a small wooden box. I've been carrying this since that day, he said. Inside was the sapphire ring, but this time he didn't hand it to me. He placed it on the counter, between us. If you're ready, he said, and only if you want to, I'd like to ask you again. He didn't kneel. There were no photographers, no applause, no glittering lights, just two people, and a promise waiting to be spoken. I picked up the ring. It was light, beautiful, and for the first time, it didn't feel like a chain. I looked up and smiled. Ask me. His eyes lit up, and his voice, steady as ever, asked, Sophia De Laurentiis, will you marry me? Not because you have to, but because you want to spend your life with me? Tears burned the edges of my vision. Yes, I said again, but this time it was mine to give. We didn't announce the wedding to the world. There were no invitations printed in gold, no media outlets tipped off, no luxury press release, just a single phone call to a small chapel perched on the cliffs of Santorini. Whitewashed walls, a wooden cross, the sound of the sea breaking just below. That's all we needed. The day we left Athens, the sky was pale and soft. Papa stood at the bakery door as we pulled away, his eyes bright with pride. He had his strength back now, his laughter, his dignity. And I had my choice. I had Alexios. When we arrived at the chapel, the wind danced through my hair and filled my lungs with the scent of salt and blooming jasmine. It didn't feel like a ceremony. It felt like a release, a letting go of all the weight we both had carried. My dress was simple, off-white, flowing, the same one I'd worn at the first wedding. But now it felt different. It didn't hang heavy, on my body like an expectation. It floated around me like freedom. Alexios stood at the altar in a linen suit. No tie, no mask, just him, steady, waiting, his gaze calm and certain. There were no rows of strangers watching, only Papa, a handful of bakery neighbors who'd become family, and two little girls from Plaka tossing petals from wicker baskets. As I walked toward him, something stirred in my chest. Not fear, not doubt, just peace. The priest spoke in Greek, but I heard only Alexios. When it was time for him to speak, he didn't read from anything. No script, no polished speech. He looked at me like I was music, and then he said, Sophia, I bought your future once, but I never wanted to own your heart. Today I ask for it, not as payment, but as a gift. You are my breath when the world feels too loud, my peace when my name means nothing. I promise you not just loyalty, but presence. Not just protection, but partnership. I love you, and I will keep loving you, even when the flower runs out, even when the violin goes quiet. Tears slid down my cheeks like they'd been waiting there for years, and when it was my turn, I spoke, without thinking, because every word had lived inside me for so long. Alexios, I don't want the yachts. I don't want the empire. I want the way you fold napkins when no one's looking, the way you carry flour like it's gold, the way you waited, not for a bride, but for me. I give you my heart, not out of obligation, but because it's never belonged to anyone else. He slipped the sapphire ring onto my finger. And this time, it wasn't a symbol of a deal. It was a beginning. Later that night, under fairy lights and the soft hum of violin strings, played by a friend who used to sneak sugar cookies from our bakery, Alexios pulled me into a slow dance, his hand on my back, his breath warm against my cheek. "This," he whispered, "is just the beginning, Mrs. Dracos." And I laughed, not the polite laugh of a bride, but the real kind, the kind that rises from a soul finally home. We returned to Athens a week after the wedding, not as strangers hiding behind names or money, not as people trapped in silence or debt, but as two people who had chosen each other freely, without pressure, without lies. The bakery was still the same. The smell of warm bread still greeted us before the bell above the door did. The oven still groaned. The counter still had a crack running along the edge like a wrinkle in an old smile. But now everything felt different, because now it was ours. Alexios didn't leave for meetings or yachts or boardrooms. Not at first. He stayed. He woke up early and learned how to braid dough. He mopped the floors. He painted the shutters himself, laughing when he accidentally turned his white shirt mint green. The neighbors noticed, but they didn't gossip. They smiled, because they saw what I saw, not a billionaire hiding in a bakery, but a man finally building a life that made sense. And me? I played my violin again, not in secret, not just at night. We cleared a small space at the front of the shop, hung up old string lights, put out 2 wooden chairs and a tiny sign that said, "Live music on Sundays," and when I played, the sound didn't carry sorrow anymore. It carried joy, laughter, belonging. Papa got better, slowly but surely. Some mornings, he even came downstairs and helped shape the pastries like he used to. Watching him laugh with Alexios over burnt croissants or sticky jam brought something to my chest that words couldn't touch. We moved into a small house just 5 blocks away. Nothing grand. Nothing gold. But in the garden, we planted jasmine, and every evening, its scent floated through our windows like a memory we'd promised to keep. Alexios still had his other life, his family's empire, but he never let it touch this place. When the press finally found out who I was, he stood in front of every camera and told them one thing. "She's not the story. I am, and I choose her." Then he turned his back on the noise and came home, to me. One night after closing the bakery, I sat at our kitchen table and looked at him, really looked at him, and I said, "Do you ever miss the yachts?" He smiled. "Only when I have to carry flour on foot." I laughed, the kind of laugh that shakes the heart loose. And then he leaned across the table, his hand finding mine, and said, "I never knew what I was searching for until the day I stepped into your bakery, soaked, lost, and you handed me a loaf of bread like it was nothing." I looked at him, eyes full. "And you took it," I said, "like it meant everything." That's how love works sometimes, not with diamonds or contracts, but with warm bread, quiet music, and 2 people willing to keep showing up, no matter how many secrets, storms, or misunderstandings tried to tear them apart. We didn't build a fairy tale, we built a home, and every morning, when the shutters open and the scent of sugar fills the air, I remember, he was a stranger once. But now, he's the rhythm behind every song I play, the man who said, "Your freedom is always yours," and proved it with love.